When I first moved into that quiet street, I didn't expect anything more than a roof over my head and a place to clear my thoughts. The neighborhood was older, the kind where hedges were neatly trimmed and porches carried the weight of time. Most houses looked alike except for one, hers. A garden spilled over the front yard, roses and lavender leaning into the breeze, vines climbing the white wooden fence like they had been there forever. That was where I saw her for the first time. She was kneeling in the soil, her hair pinned loosely at the back but strands slipping forward every time she leaned closer to the earth. She didn't notice me right away. I had paused at the gate, holding a box under my arm, feeling almost intrusive for staring too long. But there was something about the way she moved, calm, steady, with a quiet grace, that made me stay rooted. When she finally looked up, her eyes caught mine, not startled, not distant, just a measured glance, steady enough to make me shift my weight. She brushed soil from her palms, rising slowly, and for a moment I was struck by how effortlessly dignified she seemed. Her features carried both strength and a kind of softness that doesn't need to announce itself, it lingers. "You must be the new neighbor," she said, her voice warm but reserved, as though she was used to being polite but cautious. "Yes," I replied, suddenly aware of the cardboard box in my arms, still finding my way around. She smiled faintly, one corner of her lips curving. "It's a quiet place. You'll get used to it." When she stepped closer, she extended her hand. I shifted the box awkwardly to my other side and took it. Her skin was soft, but the faint roughness at the tips of her fingers told me she worked with her hands often. The handshake was brief, but there was something grounding in the warmth of her touch. "I'm Elena," she said simply. The name suited her. Elegant, enduring. I repeated it softly, more to myself than to her. She noticed, though, and tilted her head as if reading me. Our conversation stayed on safe topics, the garden, the weather, where I'd moved from. Yet even then, I felt a subtle undercurrent I couldn't name. Her smile never lingered too long. Her eyes carried something behind them, a quiet history I didn't want to intrude upon but couldn't ignore. As I walked back to my house, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. She was still there, bending back to her garden, but slower now, thoughtful. The faint scent of roses carried on the air, mingling with the memory of her voice. It was a simple meeting, ordinary to anyone else. But for me, it felt like the opening of a door I hadn't known existed. One that, once seen, I knew I would not be able to close again. Over the next few weeks, our paths seemed to cross more often than chance should allow. Sometimes it was as simple as her waving from the porch as I left for work, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. Other times it was her carrying a bag of groceries just a little too heavy for one person, and I'd find myself jogging across the street before I could overthink it. The first time I helped her, she tried to protest politely, "I've got it, really," but the strain in her voice gave her away. I took the bag anyway, brushing past her hand. The brief contact was nothing more than knuckles grazing, but it left a warmth that lingered longer than it should have. Inside, her home carried the same feeling as her garden. Lived in but tended with quiet care. Wooden shelves lined with books, framed photographs of places rather than people, curtains that let in more light than they blocked. I remember how she noticed me glancing around. "It's not much," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But it's mine." I wanted to tell her that it was more than enough, that it felt alive, full of her presence. But instead I only nodded, afraid my words might sound too heavy. Soon, sharing tea on her porch became a rhythm of its own. She brewed it strong, the kind that lingered on the tongue, and always served it in mismatched cups that somehow fit perfectly together. I'd sit beside her, close enough that our sleeves brushed whenever either of us reached for the teapot. Those small touches, innocent, fleeting, were the kind that made my chest tighten without warning. One afternoon, as we talked about the simplest things, gardens, music, the stubborn creak of old floorboards, her laughter came unexpectedly. Not a polite chuckle, but a true laugh that softened her entire face. For a second, she seemed years younger, and I couldn't help but watch her a little too long. She noticed. Her laughter faded into a small, knowing smile, and she looked away, sipping her tea to cover the silence. There was one moment that stayed with me more than the rest. A warm breeze swept across the porch, pulling strands of hair from her loose clip. They fell across her cheek, and as she lifted her hand to tuck them back, her wrist brushed against my arm. Neither of us moved quickly. For the briefest heartbeat, it was as if the world narrowed to that simple point of contact. We didn't speak of it. She let the moment pass, shifting the conversation back to something ordinary. But when she looked at me again, her gaze lingered just a little too long, her eyes carrying a question she wasn't ready to ask. And I realized, sitting there with tea cooling in my hand, that the silence between us was no longer empty. It was charged, gentle, unspoken, alive. It was a late evening in early autumn when the storm rolled in. I remember the way the clouds hung low, swallowing the last bit of daylight until the street seemed cloaked in shadow. Rain hammered against the rooftops, and then, without warning, the power went out. The street lamps died one by one, leaving the neighborhood in darkness. I was standing at my window when I noticed the faint glow of a candle flickering across the street from her house. A few minutes later, a knock echoed at my door. When I opened it, there she was, holding a candle in a simple brass holder, the light softening her features. "I thought you might not have candles yet," she said with a small smile. "I brought one." The gesture was simple, but it felt strangely intimate. Her thinking of me in the middle of a storm. I thanked her, and she hesitated before asking, "Would you rather sit together? The night feels heavier when it's quiet." I followed her back to her home, where more candles glowed in little pools of light across the room. Shadows flickered on the walls, stretching and swaying with every movement. We sat at her kitchen table, a candle set between us. For a while, the conversation stayed light. Books, favorite foods, the stubborn rain that refused to let up. But then, as the silence stretched, her expression shifted. She turned the candle holder slowly in her hands, her eyes following the flame. "It's strange," she murmured, her voice low, "how a house can be full of things and still feel empty." I didn't answer right away. I sensed this was not just a passing thought but something deeper, something heavy she carried. She drew in a slow breath. "It's been years since he passed. People think time fixes everything, but it doesn't. It just teaches you how to hide it better." Her words trembled, though her tone was steady. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the table, speaking softly. "You don't have to hide it with me." Her eyes lifted to mine, and in the candlelight they seemed almost glassy. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against my wrist as if to anchor herself. The touch was delicate, uncertain, yet it made my pulse race beneath her fingertips. "You're kind," she whispered, almost as if it were a confession. "And I don't remember the last time someone listened without looking at me with pity." I shook my head gently. "I don't pity you. I just see you." Her breath caught, and for a moment the silence between us was heavier than the storm outside. The flame flickered, casting shadows that painted her face with equal parts strength and fragility. When her hand slipped away from mine, it left behind a warmth I couldn't shake. She straightened in her chair, forcing a smile as though she had revealed too much. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I don't usually talk like this." "You don't have to apologize," I told her. "I'm glad you did." And as the rain beat against the windows and the candles burned low, I knew that this night had shifted something between us. Something fragile, unspoken, and irreversible. The storm from that night seemed to linger in my mind for days, but the world outside moved on. Autumn deepened, the trees along the street turning shades of copper and gold, their leaves scattering across the pavement. One afternoon, I noticed her in the yard, rushing to take down the laundry before another round of rain. Dark clouds gathered above, and the wind tugged at the sheets, snapping them like sails. Without thinking, I jogged across the street to help. She glanced at me, strands of hair already loose around her face, and gave a faint laugh. "You always seem to appear just when I need another pair of hands." "I'll take that as a compliment," I said, grabbing at a bedsheet before it flew away. The storm edged closer, the first drops of rain splattering against our shoulders as we worked side by side. The fabric twisted in the wind, pulling from her grip into mine, then back again until finally, both our hands closed over the same corner of the sheet. And then silence. Not outside. The rain was pouring harder now, thunder rolling in the distance. But between us, in that charged moment, everything stilled. Our fingers touched first, then pressed together, holding the damp fabric. Her skin was cool from the sudden chill in the air, but the contact sent a pulse of warmth through me. I should have let go, should have moved quickly to the next task, but neither of us did. Her eyes lifted, meeting mine, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her irises, close enough to feel the quickened pace of my own breath. She didn't speak, and neither did I. Words would have felt clumsy, too small for the electricity threading between our hands. A drop of rain slid down her cheek, catching in her hair. My instinct was to reach out, to brush it away, but I froze. Instead, I tightened my grip on the sheet, and she noticed. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. The thunder cracked closer, shaking the moment apart. She pulled back suddenly, gathering the sheet against her chest. "We'd better hurry," she said quickly, her voice steadier than the look in her eyes. We rushed the rest of the laundry inside, moving too fast to speak, though the silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy, saturated with what almost happened. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rain and fresh cotton. She busied herself, folding quickly, her hands moving faster than usual. When she finally looked at me again, her cheeks carried a faint flush, whether from the storm or something else I couldn't tell. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice softer this time, almost tender. I only nodded, afraid that if I spoke, the weight of everything unspoken would spill out. That night, lying awake in my room, I replayed that brief moment, her hand against mine, the way time seemed to pause, the unspoken question in her eyes. And I realized with a mix of fear and certainty that what we were stepping into was no longer ordinary. For days after the storm, there was a distance between us. Not a deliberate one, but the kind born of hesitation. I still caught glimpses of her, watering the garden, stepping out to check the mail, but the warmth of our earlier conversations seemed to have retreated behind a polite smile. It weighed on me, the unspoken shift. I told myself to be patient, to give her space. But when the invitation came, slipped casually across the fence one late afternoon, it felt like a door opening again. She stood with a casserole dish in her hands, pretending it was nothing. "I made too much for one," she said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of confidence and hesitation. "Come by tonight if you'd like." Her home glowed warmly when I arrived. The dining table was set with quiet care. 2 plates, candles flickering gently, a bottle of wine already opened. She laughed softly as she poured me a glass. "Don't read too much into it," she teased. "I just hate eating alone." But the truth lay between us, undeniable. Dinner was simple but comforting. Roasted chicken, vegetables, bread still warm from the oven. We talked, we laughed, and for a while it felt easy again, as though nothing had shifted. Yet as the night wore on, the laughter softened, replaced by a fragile quiet. When I stood to leave, she followed me to the door. Her hand lingered on the frame, her posture leaning just slightly toward me, though her eyes seemed to struggle with something unsaid. I turned to thank her, but before the words left my mouth, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost trembling. "I don't know why this is so hard," she admitted. "Being with you feels good, but it scares me too. It scares me because I haven't let myself feel alive in so long. And part of me thinks I shouldn't." Her confession landed heavy, vulnerable. My chest tightened at the rawness in her voice. I wanted to reach for her, but I held myself still, letting her speak. "I've spent years telling myself it was easier to stay closed off," she continued, her hand brushing her hair back nervously. "Safer. But then you came along, and suddenly the walls I built don't feel strong anymore. I don't know what that says about me, or what it says about you." Her gaze lifted to mine, unsteady but searching. I swallowed, My own voice quiet. Maybe it just means you're ready to feel again. And maybe I'm just lucky enough to be here when you are. For a moment, the air between us was unbearably still. Her hand, trembling faintly, lifted toward me before stopping just short, hovering in the space between us. Her breath caught, her lips parting as though she wanted to close the distance but couldn't. Instead, she let out a soft, almost broken laugh, lowering her hand. "I don't even know what I'm asking for," she whispered. But I did, and it was written in her eyes. The night after her confession lingered in my mind like a melody that refused to fade. Every word she'd spoken replayed itself in quiet echoes, the fear in her tone, the vulnerability in her eyes. I thought perhaps she might retreat again, hide behind politeness as she had before. But when I knocked on her door the following evening, she opened it with an expression that told me she had made a choice. Her hair was loose this time, falling naturally around her shoulders, and her eyes, though nervous, carried a quiet determination. She didn't ask me why I'd come. She simply stepped aside, letting me in, as though she had been waiting. The house was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp spilling across the living room. She motioned for me to sit, but instead of taking her chair, she lowered herself onto the sofa beside me. The closeness was immediate, intimate. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the faint tremor in her breathing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the quiet hum of the night outside. Then, slowly, she turned to me. Her hand lifted, uncertain at first, before resting flat against my chest. The weight of it was light, almost tentative, but I felt it in my heartbeat. Fast, uneven, pressing against her palm. Her voice was low, almost breaking. "It's been years since I felt this way," she whispered, her eyes locking with mine. The honesty in them undid me. "Don't make me wait any longer." The words hung in the air, fragile and trembling, yet powerful in their honesty. I didn't move immediately, couldn't. I wanted her to know that I heard the fear in her plea just as much as the desire. My hand covered hers, pressing gently over my chest, grounding both of us in the steadiness of the moment. "You don't have to wait," I said softly. Her breath caught, her shoulders easing as if she had been carrying the weight of those words for far too long. She leaned closer, so close I could feel the warmth of her breath, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her hair. Her forehead brushed against my shoulder, and she let out a trembling sigh, almost like a release. My arm lifted instinctively, wrapping around her, holding her as though she might break if I let go too soon. For the first time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she nestled closer, her cheek resting against me, her hand still pressed to my heartbeat. In that stillness, I realized it wasn't just desire she was asking for. It was permission. Permission to be seen, to feel again, to let someone step past the walls she had lived behind for so long. I held her tighter, silently promising her she didn't need to wait anymore. The world outside seemed to fade that night. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, tapping softly against the windows, while inside her living room the air felt still, almost sacred. She remained close against me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder, her hand still pressed to my chest as though memorizing the rhythm of my heartbeat. Neither of us hurried to speak. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive, after everything that had been said. Instead, I focused on the subtle details. The way her breathing gradually steadied against me, the delicate brush of her hair against my jaw, the warmth of her body leaning into mine. I traced a slow circle with my thumb over the back of her hand, not to lead her anywhere, but simply to remind her I was there. Steady, present. She responded by entwining her fingers with mine, the gesture quiet but decisive. It was a kind of acceptance, one that said more than any confession could. At some point, she pulled back just enough to look at me. Her eyes were softer than I'd ever seen them, no longer guarded, no longer weighed down by hesitation. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that letting myself feel again would dishonor the life I had before, and afraid of what people might say." I shook my head gently, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. You don't have to be afraid with me. What you had before will always matter. But so does what's here now. Her lips trembled with the hint of a smile, one touched by both relief and emotion. You're too young to be this patient, she teased softly, though the words carried no distance this time, only tenderness. Maybe, I admitted, but for you I don't mind waiting. Not if it means this. She leaned closer again, and for the first time her arms slipped fully around me. It wasn't a rushed embrace, not one born of desperation, but something far deeper. Her cheek rested against my chest, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat matching mine. The embrace lingered, long and unbroken, until it felt less like a beginning and more like a promise. Eventually, we moved to the sofa cushions, sitting side by side but still holding hands, our shoulders pressed together. The candle on the side table had burned low, casting a soft, golden haze across the room. She sighed, content in a way I hadn't heard from her before, and rested her head lightly against me once more. I didn't think of what tomorrow might bring, or of the doubts that might creep back. In that moment, there was only the stillness of her presence, the warmth of her touch, and the quiet certainty that whatever path we were stepping onto, we would walk it together. And as the night deepened, I realized it wasn't the plea she had whispered that I would remember most. It was this, her trust, her vulnerability, and the gentle affection that promised we were no longer waiting. Sparkles, this closes the story arc with tenderness, safety, and emotional fulfillment. Perfect for a YouTube narration. Crescent Moon, if this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more slow burn age gap romances. Leave a comment sharing the moment that moved you most. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you know someone who enjoys heartfelt storytelling, share this with them too. Until next time, thank you for listening.